Hey everybody. This is the opening stuff, the primarily the translator's introduction, and what else? Primarily the translator's introduction to uh, history and structure, an essay on Hegelian-Marxist and Structuralist theories of history by Alfred Schmidt. Table of contents says translator's introduction, the theme, history without structure, structure without history, history and structure index. So I'll probably end up, the piece itself looks like it's quite long. The history and structure is 100 pages long, so I'm going to be breaking that up somehow. So the acknowledgments comes from Jeffrey Herf. Jeffrey Herf now writes primarily about anti-Semitism. I actually have a few pieces by him on this channel. But these are his acknowledgments. I would like to thank Thomas McCarthy, and I'm not sure if I'm correct on this or not, but I think Thomas McCarthy has written on like Marx and the Ancients, but I'm not sure. It might be someone else. Thomas McCarthy for reading the first draft of this translation and offering numerous suggestions, and for his encouragement and support from the beginning of this project. Andy Buchwalter, Fred von Gelter, and their assistance and suggestions. Alfred Schmidt for his encouragement, and Christoph Schlotterer of Hanser Verlag in Munich for his editorial support. Translator's introduction. So here we go. Here's the main piece. It is remarkable that the extensive controversy over structuralist Marxism in the English-speaking world has provoked no book-length critique by a critical theorist that confronts structuralist claims on a philosophical plane. Isn't that what, I think there was a couple. There's a collection, so maybe it's not book length, but it was a collection of essays titled One-Dimensional Marxism, which had like 100-page meditation on Althusserian Marxism. I think it's called Althusserian Marxism by, what's his name? God, I'm blanking out. Simon Clark. And I think also The Poverty of Theory by E.P. Thompson also was kind of like an extended meditation on structuralist Marxism, or at least parts of it. I think it's a collection of essays. I've never read it myself, so I'm talking a bit about out of my hiney, but interesting. Alfred Schmidt's History and Structure fills this gap. In West Germany today, Schmidt is the leading exponent of and commentator on the critical theory of the Frankfurt School as formulated by Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and Herbert Marcuse. Only one of his books, The Concept of Nature and Marx, has been translated into English, however, and thus the full scope of Schmidt's work remains largely unknown to the Anglo-American audience. Schmidt's other books and essays over the last 2 decades include critical studies of Feuerbach, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Horkheimer, and Marcuse, as well as discussions of the philosophy of history, the history of 19th and 20th century philosophical materialism, and Marx, in particular the epistemological aspects of his critique of political economy. Like the first generation of critical theorists, Schmidt's understanding of Marx and Marxism freely incorporates non-Marxist traditions with the aim of preserving the critical intentions that are lost when Marxism ceases to be a critical theory of society and becomes instead a, quote, science of legitimation, end quote. Hence, it is hardly surprising that he took up the challenge posed by Althusser's militant reaffirmation of Marxism's scientific pretensions. Schmidt's response to Althusser's Marxism is the most sustained to have emerged from many theorists associated with the Frankfurt School. It comprises several essays written in the late 1960s, including History and Structure, and a later work, Die kritische Theorie als Geschichtsphilosophie, Structural Theory as a Philosophy of History, published in 1976. History and Structure is more than a valuable intervention in the controversy over Althusser's Marxism. History and Structure also offers an interpretation of the mature Marx and the influence of Hegel and Marx's critique of political economy, and in doing so recasts some of the terms of the debate between what Alvin Gouldner called, quote, the two Marxisms, end quote. This translation should both encourage further interest in Schmidt's other works and alert an English-speaking audience to the existence of the extensive philosophically informed discussion of Marx which has taken place in West Germany in the last decade and which remains largely untranslated. In History and Structure, Schmidt emphasizes the enduring influence of Hegel and Marx's mature critique of political economy, and thus reaffirms one of the major themes of Hegelian-Marxism, or quote Hegelian-Marxism. However, the way in which Schmidt locates this influence distinguishes Schmidt's analysis from that of, for example, Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, or Marcuse's Reason and Revolution, whereas Hegelian Marxists have traditionally stressed Hegel's phenomenology of the mind, or phenomenology of spirit, and thus the enduring significance of the themes of alienation, objectification, and reification of consciousness and social existence in Marx's Grundrisse and Capital. Schmidt, without rejecting this view, gives added weight to the importance of Hegel's The Science of Logic. To the reader who has been accustomed to assigning the systematic aspects of Hegel's work to the prehistory of Soviet Marxism's Science of Society and Nature, this is a startling tack for a Hegelian Marxist to take. Just when it appeared that two Marxism could be neatly correlated with two Marxes, Schmidt and others have come along to wreak havoc with this schema. Before turning to Schmidt's own contribution, a brief discussion of the two Marxisms is in order. Gouldner succinctly summarized the dispute between Marxism as a critique or critical Marxism and Marxism as a science or scientific Marxism. The former affirms the positive impact of Hegel, in particular, and German idealism in general on the young and old Marx, stressing the importance of the young Marx and the problem of alienation in Marx's mature political economy. The latter scientific Marxism, sees Hegelian and idealist influences as unfortunate, quote, ideological, end quote, baggage supposedly jettisoned by Marx after a radical break, or an epistemological break, with Hegel. This break pointed to scientific, quote, structuralist, end quote, methodology which came to fruition in the post-humanist, post-historicist, mature political economy of Capital, Marx's Capital. These textual disputes have never been purely academic affairs. Since the codification of Soviet Marxism in the 1920s and the accompanying self-understanding of Marxism-Leninism as a science of the laws of society and nature, quote, Western Marxism has repeatedly expressed itself in fleeting expositions of individual and collective subjectivity and activity, the workers' councils in Central Europe following World War I, the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, and the New Left in Europe and North America in the 1960s. The intensity with which the dispute over the interpretation of Marx has been conducted cannot be understood without taking this historical experience into account, an experience including both the history of Stalinism and the revolt against Stalinism. However, although the notion of the, quote, two Marxisms, end quote, sheds a great deal of light on the matter, it should not be taken to overly schematic conclusions. As Maurice Merleau-Ponty pointed out in The Adventures of the Dialectic, the objectivist scientism of Soviet Marxism also allowed plenty of room for subjectivity of the party, a, quote, authoritarian voluntarism, end quote, in Marcuse's words. And I think that authoritarian voluntarism comes to an extreme extent in Maoism. Just a side note for myself. On the other hand, as Schmidt has argued in his Drei Studien über Materialismus, I think it's 3 studies on materialism, philosophical materialism in both Marxist and non-Marxist incarnations recalls individual happiness, individual needs and satisfactions, individual willing, in contrast to the mythology of a justificatory idealist metaphysic of history. The situation is further complicated by the fact that some important exponents or sympathetic interpreters of the critical tradition agree with some of the contentions put forward by structuralists. For example, while fundamentally disagreeing with Althusser's intentions, Jürgen Habermas, Albrecht Wellmer, Jean Baudrillard, Cornelius Castoriadis, E.P. Thompson have in varying fashions argued that Marx's mature political economy presents a, quote, latent positivism, end quote, quote, a mirror of production, end quote, a rationalistic bias, or a, quote, prison of political economy, end quote, all of which provided the soil in which the authoritarian Marxism of the Stalinist tradition could take root. Along similar lines, Paul Brines and Andrew Arato have suggested that the history of Marxism can be understood as a cyclical alternation between Romantic and Enlightenment rationalistic poles, a cycle first made manifest in the biography of Marx himself. What these authors within the Hegelian-Marxist tradition have in common is an implicit, at times explicit, exasperation with Marx's critique of political economy, because it succumbs to more than it criticizes the life and culture of capitalism. It attempts to do the impossible, namely to force the multiple dimensions of politics, law, experience, feeling, culture, race, sex, language, or social interaction into the one dimension defined by the categories of political economy. No longer interested in fighting a battle of text in order to rescue Marx's critique of political economy from structuralist misinterpretations, some members of the Hegelian-Marxist tradition are pointing toward a post-Marxist critical social theory. With a few notable exceptions, critical Marxists in Great Britain and in the United States have in fact largely given up the ghost of Marx's political economy. The dialectical unity of philosophy, history, and political economy that Marx sought, at least within the English language discussion of Marx and Marxism, most emphatically split asunder. To critical Marxist and Habermasian ears, the sound of Marx's political economy rings of orthodoxy and scientism. For example, Thompson sees in Marx's mature political economy a, quote, unreconstructed Hegelianism, end quote, through which a ghostly autonomy is bestowed on, quote, capital in the totality of its relations, end quote. A capital which, quote, posits this and that, creates this and that, end quote. Thompson agrees with Schmidt that the influence of Hegel persisted in the mature Marx, yet unlike Schmidt, Thompson sees this influence as disastrous, as the harbinger of a closed ahistorical system that, quote, dialectical materialism, end quote, was to become. Thompson regards as a disservice Althusser's efforts to, quote, thrust historical materialism back into the prison of the categories of political economy, end quote. Thompson. In Thompson's view, experience, values, culture, feeling were stifled in the Stalinist discourse of political economy and Hegelian rigor and system. Just a side note, this is why I think the concept of levels of abstraction is so tremendously important, because when you're trying to give it an abstract general overall depiction of the necessary features of a capitalist mode of production, that does not exclude doing the kind of empirical, historical, or sociological work that people like E.P. Thompson does and did. Yeah, I'll be out. Dinner's almost ready. My mommy's making dinner. Anyway, whereas Thompson appeals to the British tradition of social history against the imperialistic claims of Marxist scientism, Schmidt appeals to the German tradition of dialectical social theory, which includes Hegel and political economy, as his counter to the Althusserian project. In this context, Alfred Schmidt's defense of the mature Marx, his refusal to view the young Marx as the exponent of an ahistorical ontology, and his insistence on the indispensability of the critique of political economy to a contemporary critical theory of society will strike some as out of step and unfashionable, which in a sense they are, but they certainly do not constitute a renewal of orthodoxy and scientism, nor do they pose yet another in a depressing series of false alternatives, Marxism or Romanticism, Hegel or political economy, alienation or surplus value, history or structure. In Schmidt's view, the quote, and, end quote, in the title of his essay belongs between the preceding conceptual pairs as well. Schmidt's refusal to accept the validity of Althusser's interpretation of Marx recalls the Adorno sentence which he cites, quote, the shrinking of the consciousness of historical continuity is more than an aspect of decline. It is necessarily linked with the principle of progress in bourgeois society, end quote. Adorno. Marxism as a tradition is not immune from the spirit of progress. It can forget the historical critical dimension of Marx's mature work, just as easily as it can forget Hegel. Schmidt's intent in History and Structure is not to add to the mountain of Marxology, but to affirm the historical consciousness which structuralism denies. I would like now to sketch a few of the basic themes which have consistently appeared in Schmidt's work. The concept of, quote, second nature, and, quote, a crucial concept for the first generation of the Frankfurt School, is in Schmidt's view, quote, the most important methodological idea of the materialist dialectic, end quote. The concept second nature seeks to distinguish, quote, first nature, that is the interaction between human beings and nature which is at the basis of all human existence, from, quote, second nature, or from his interaction, or the form this interaction assumes in a historically specific society. Against Engels' effort to develop a supra-historical dialectic applicable equally to nature and society, Schmidt stresses the socio-historical character of Marx's concept of nature. Moreover, following Horkheimer and Adorno, he places the subject-object dialectic at the center of his social theory. The subject transforms nature and him/herself through labor, and in the very process falls under the sway of second nature, a blind necessity set against its creators. Marx's materialism, Schmidt argues, far from acquiescing to the appearance of iron historical laws, constituted a, quote, unified critical judgment on previous history, to the extent that men have allowed themselves to be degraded into objects of the blind and mechanical process of its economic dynamic, end quote. Schmidt. Previous history thus remains prehistory, one not yet guided by the practice of consciously acting subjects. Thus Marx's concept of labor and praxis preserves the problem of constitution of the world by the knowing subject as presented in Kant and Hegel, and upholds, quote, the idealist moment of creation and the moment of the independence of consciousness from external being, end quote. Marx. For Marx and Hegel, Schmidt claims, the, quote, highest form of epistemology, end quote, is contained in the theory of prehistory as the critique of second nature. This whole problem of constitution was repressed by, quote, orthodox, end quote, Marxism, which thus ceased to be a critical theory of society. It elevated the, quote, laws of second nature, the existence of which depended, in Marx's view, on the continued existence of specific social conditions and human unconsciousness, into laws of history in general. Quote, what in Marx is the object of critique is in Stalinism raised to the rank of a scientific norm, end quote. Schmidt. While this procedure had its uses in the creation of state religions, it had nothing to do with a, quote, originally critical and radical historical theory, end quote. Schmidt. The latter seeks to uncover the human activity now submerged in the established facts. Schmidt agrees with Adorno's assertion that, quote, the strongest motives of Marxist theory, end quote, did not suggest the ontologization of, quote, natural laws, end quote, in history, but rather their abolition. I'm going to copy that down. In the context of the Hegelian-Marxist tradition, Schmidt's treatment of Marx is unusual. In Schmidt's treatment of Marx's emphasis on the Schmidt's treatment of Marx, Jesus Christ. In the context of the Hegelian-Marxist tradition, Schmidt's treatment of Marx is unusual in its emphasis on the critique of political economy, and what Schmidt refers to as Marx's, quote, second appropriation of Hegel, end quote. Schmidt. This refers to Marx's incorporation of Hegel's philosophy of nature, lectures on the philosophy of history, and above all, the science of logic, as distinguished from the phenomenology of mind, a work whose impact was decisive for the Paris manuscripts of 1844. The importance of Hegel's logic for Marx's Capital was emphasized by Lenin in Lenin's philosophical notebooks, but this argument has remained undeveloped, certainly within the critical tradition. Schmidt and other critical West German commentators on Marx of the past 15 years, such as Hans-Jürgen Krahl, Helmut Reichelt, and Michael Teunissen, have offered the most extensive development of this interpretation since Lenin, and have done so in an epistemological framework decidedly other than that set by Lenin. Schmidt argues that what has too often been criticized as the objectivism or scientism of the late Marx is rather the product of Marx's effort to grasp the specific historical character of the abstractions through which capitalist social relations find expression. Where Hegel saw the movement of categories as the manifestation of a supra-historical Geist, Marx saw the categories of bourgeois political economy as, quote, finite, transient, end quote, products of the finite and transient reality of capitalism. Why then is Marx's critique of political economy so often characterized as the most objectivistic and most ahistorical aspect of his thought? The reason, Schmidt argues, is with the exception of some of Horkheimer's essays in the 30s, the important distinction between, quote, inquiry, Forschung, and, quote, presentation, Darstellung, has largely been ignored by commentators on Marx's Capital. Quote, the correct understanding of Marx's method in Capital, end quote, Schmidt wrote in 1967, quote, stands and falls with the conception of presentation, end quote. The, quote, mode of presentation, end quote, Darstellungsweise, in Capital, does not follow the narrative history of its development, but begins with the finished forms, money, commodities, exchange value, etc., in which the system reproduces itself. Hence, in the first volume of Marx's Capital, it is not until chapter 24 that the historical presuppositions of the analysis of commodity fetishism developed in chapter 1 are presented. The logical construction of Marx's categorical analysis of capitalism is in reverse order to the actual, historical sequence in which the social relations underlying these categories developed. Schmidt emphasizes, however, that while the, quote, mode of presentation, end quote, does not parallel the actual course of events, it does presuppose them and is not intended to replace them and to establish a methodological primacy of structure over history. The categories of Marx's critique of political economy and capital and the Grundrisse ought not to be separated from the historic reality of capitalism. The non-identity of essence and appearance that Marx took over from Hegel's logic applies to capitalist commodity production rather than to social life in general. It is with the development of capitalism that the products of human labor become commodities, that relations between human beings assume the appearance of relations between things, and that the personal forms of domination that characterize pre-capitalist society assume abstract and impersonal forms. Marx's critique of political economy aims at recovering the constitutive human praxis and subjectivity that lay beneath the surface of appearances of capitalism. It is a continuation of his fundamental project, the critique of, quote, second nature, end quote. Hence, although Marx did not write a philosophical epistemology, Marx's critique of political economy, Schmidt argues, contains a, quote, richness in philosophically important insights and problems, end quote, that remains to be examined. As a theory of social consciousness and unconsciousness, Marx's work is simultaneously social theory and epistemology. Schmidt's understanding of Marx's critique of political economy as part of a critical theory of society, as well as his critique of structuralism, draw heavily on Horkheimer's distinction between traditional and critical theory. Briefly, Horkheimer argued that unlike traditional theory, which assumed that social relations did not at all enter into its own methods and intentions, critical theory is defined by the unflinching reflection on its own historical and social determination. Critical theory views society from the standpoint of what critical theory judges to be the interests of the individuals in a free and rational organization of social life. These interests are not external to the process of cognition. Rather, they constitute it and see to it that theory examines existing forces from the perspective of their possible transformation. In short, a critical theory views existing facts as themselves historical products. They appear to be natural phenomena, that history up to the present appears to be a process without a subject, that social being determines social consciousness, or that individuals appear as personifications of economic categories. All of these circumstances are aspects of, quote, prehistory. an era which presupposes the very absence of historical consciousness which critical theory seeks to nurture. Only when individuals collectively control the life processes that have previously ruled them with the force of a blind fate will human freedom for the individual be possible. Then historical materialism will cease to be the proper explanation of historical and social processes. As Horkheimer put it, quote, the critical recognition of the categories dominating social life contains simultaneously their condemnation, end quote. Horkheimer. For critical theory incorporates Kant's idea of human autonomy. Quote, a consciously critical attitude, is part of the development of society. Construing the course of history as the necessary product of an economic mechanism simultaneously contains both a protest against this order of things, a protest generated by the order itself, and the idea of self-determination for the human race, that is, the idea of a state of affairs in which man's actions no longer flow from a mechanism, but from man's own decision. The judgment passed on the necessity inherent in the previous course of events implies here a struggle to change it from a blind to a meaningful necessity, end quote. Horkheimer. The passage to a free and rational society is not at all guaranteed by blind necessity. Rather, it depends on the moral decision of individuals. To elevate history without a subject to a scientific norm, as traditional and structuralist theories do to make, quote, the claim that events are absolutely necessary, means in the last analysis the same thing as the claim to be really free here and now, resignation in practice, end quote. Thus Schmidt takes up Horkheimer's argument that the good society, a socialist society, is historically possible but is not guaranteed by a logic immanent in history. It can be created only by individuals who have consciously chosen this option. As Horkheimer argued, however, the, quote, free subject consciously forming social existence, end quote, has not pre-existed in history. To bring this subject into existence is both the means and end of bringing about a rationally organized socialist society. Schmidt notes that there is an ironic agreement here with the structuralist, quote, scientific objectivism, end quote, which claims that a subject in history is not recognizable. But as Schmidt puts it, the issue is, quote, not only of knowledge but also of existence, end quote. And here critical theory and structuralism part ways. The fundamental point of Schmidt's critique of structuralism are implicit in Horkheimer's critique of traditional theory. In his 1969 essay titled The Structuralist Attack on History, Schmidt developed these points, foreshadowing the basic themes of the present work. Structuralism ceased to be a critical theory of society precisely because structuralism repressed the historical dimension of theory. For example, where Marx saw ideology in capitalist society as laying in appearances that could be historically transcended, Althusser naturalizes the concept of ideology by suggesting that it is a functional mystification of any social order. Rather than confronting the dilemma of truth and ideology, Althusser replaces it with the, quote, simple fiat of science, end quote. The possibility of overcoming ideology is thereby ruled out from the outset. Structuralism and structuralist Marxism thus become unintentional apologies for a still unmastered, quote, second nature, end quote. Despite its bluster, its muscular attacks on, quote, historicism and, quote, humanism, end quote, structuralism is marked above all by resignation to the appearances of a historically specific absence of human activity. It adds its voice to the conservative claim that the present has no historical dimension. By conceptually ratifying the autonomy of economic mechanisms over individual activity, structuralism has thereby captured the spirit of the age, uncritically. While presenting itself as an illusionless science in contrast to fuzzy humanism and historicism, structuralism is in actuality the illusion of the epoch. As Adorno put it, in late capitalism, ideology is the process of production itself. Thus, Schmidt's critique is aimed at what has been described as the, quote, methodological dehistoricization of Marx's analysis of capital, end quote, fostered by the Althusser circle. In summary, it is not only Althusser's attack on the notion of a unified subject in the historical process which leads Althusser to grasp history as a sequence of supra-historical structures and seeks applicable laws applicable to history in a universal schematic sense. His misunderstanding of Marx's method in Capital also contributes to his effort to establish Marxism as a general theory of history. Only the structuralist interpretation of Marx's political economy allows Althusser to graft fundamental structuralist assumptions onto a Marxist theory of history. It is only by forgetting that Marx's analysis of capitalism points to the historical origins of superhistorical appearances that Althusser is able to shift Marx's theory to the level of an analysis of laws of society in general. If, as Schmidt and other West German interpreters of Marx have argued, Marx's critique of political economy is a systematic presentation of the deformation of social relationships by capitalism, then its applicability is limited to capitalist societies. It is just this methodological restriction, these authors argue, that structuralist Marxism does not consider, and hence it wrongly transforms Marx's theory of capitalism into a general theory of society. Marx's abstraction from those aspects of individuals as subjects that are unrelated to their activity in the process of capital accumulation and realization was, they argue, never intended as a general theorem of social life, but as a critical statement about what human beings are reduced to in this particular society. Althusser's view of Marxism as a general theory of history thus undermines Marx's critique of political economy, the greater importance of Hegel's logic, as distinct from his phenomenology in Marx's mature political economy, does not, they argue, signal a repression of Marx's anthropological and epistemological insights into that human subjectivity is expressed in labor. Rather, Marx took Hegel's logic as a model which prefigured his own view of the value-realizing value self in the developed capitalist system. The element that safeguards this procedure from becoming what Thompson denounces as, quote, idealist metaphysics, end quote, is, according to these authors, the historical nature of Marx's method, that is, the consciousness that it is dealing with the particular reality of capitalism. Althusserian structuralism begins, they argue, with the dehistoricization of Marx's critique of political economy, its transformation into that against which it was directed, a general Marxist theory of history. A general Marxist theory of history. To this reconsideration of the late Hegel and Marx, Schmidt brings his interest in thinkers such as Feuerbach, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Horkheimer, and Adorno, who have defended the individual and the particular against systems in theory and society that would absorb the subject completely. It is rare to find a thinker like Schmidt who tries to capture the letter and spirit of Marx's political economy and Nietzsche's views on the uses and abuses of history. Russell Jacoby has recently written that, quote, asceticism is the conceptual center of gravity of orthodox Marxism, end quote. This, quote, puritanism of knowledge, end quote, is evident, Jacoby continues, in the fear of the unstructured, the taboo on utopia and romanticism, and the, quote, cold passion of science and authority, end quote, that marks structural Marxism. In the Marxist tradition, advocacy of what Ernst Bloch called the, quote, cold current, end quote, of technocratic Marxism has usually been associated with Marx's Capital. The paradoxical point of the present work is that Schmidt comes to the defense of what Bloch called the, quote, warm current, end quote, of Marxism, in part through reinterpretation of this supposedly, quote, cold, end quote, text. He defends the individual subject without neglecting the power of structures in prehistory. The reader should find this discussion helpful in overcoming some of the facile dichotomies between history and structure, subject and object, that have surfaced in English language discussion of Marx and structuralism. To the degree that Schmidt has been successful in channeling the, quote, warm, end quote, historical current into the seemingly cold and ahistorical waters of Marx's later work, he has made an important contribution to contemporary discussions of Marx, Marxist historiography, and critical theory. Jeffrey Herf. Jeffrey Herf. Thank you so much for listening.